Drew was more than a kilometre north of the foraging grounds, where he was supposed to be, but he had worked quickly to fill his basket, giving him time to search. It had been weeks since Nathan and Rudolph disappeared. Drew had seen Nathan vanish, and though the town council and mayor had all agreed that Rudolph had been lost the same way, Drew was not convinced. He spent as much time as possible searching for Rudolph, pushing ever further north, hoping to find the one friend he was sure was still out there, somewhere. It helped that he didn't feel comfortable in town. Drew's family blamed him for the disappearance, even claiming that Drew may have had something to do with it. They weren't alone either. Several other families had distanced themselves from him, telling their kids not to play with or even talk to him. The fir trees were densely packed, reducing his vision to a few dozen meters, but he called out occasionally, "Rudolph!" Every few minutes he would stop and call a few times before moving on, keeping an eye on the sun as he walked. The woods were dangerous at night, and he was too far north for people to hear his cries, so he would have to head back soon. Less than an hour remained before he would have to turn back for town, back to a place where most people hated him or wouldn't talk to him. The clouds were closing in, threatening to bring down the snow. The first snow was expected any day now, so he pulled his coat tightly around himself. As he was ready to turn back, Drew came to a stop, ready to call out. But as he called for the first time, he saw something, not far away. It was the remnants of a camp, a circle of stones, and the collapsed remains of a shelter. He ran over, calling out for Rudolph. After he was sure there was no response, he looked over the camp, finding a few rabbit bones, some broken pottery, and faint signs of tracks leading to a nearby stream. Following the tracks, Drew arrived at the water's edge, where he spotted a basket, ruined from weeks outdoors, but he recognized the pattern. It was Rudolph's. Gripping the remains tightly, he called out, "Rudolph! Rudolph, it's me, Drew!" He kept calling out until his voice was hoarse. Once it gave out, he looked up. The sky was growing dark, and he was late. Taking stock of his surroundings, he was soon running south, headed back for town before the sun was lost entirely. The swiftness of his pace led to a few stumbles and a grazed knee, but before the sun's light faded, he was south of the ravine and close to home. The sun had entirely set by the time he got indoors, his mother taking the basket of berries and getting straight to work, turning them to jam. Drew kept Rudolph's basket concealed, climbing up the ladder to the loft space where he and his brothers slept. Both were still down by the fire, talking about girls, waiting for Dad to come home. The campsite was definitely Rudolph's. It was quite far north. If he had been heading home, he would have been here weeks ago. So Drew suspected he'd been travelling north, away from town. Hiding the remains of the basket under his bed, he began to formulate a plan. There was no way to keep searching as he had been. He would have to head further north. He could never make it in one day. He would need supplies and a weapon. So he made plans. After his dad got home, the family assembled for dinner, Dad quizzing him and his brothers. He would always do this, asking them about the gods, ensuring that they knew the tales. His older brother always won. He could quote many of the stories by heart, but Drew was not so knowledgeable, though this evening he managed second place, so he needed only to sweep the kitchen before bed, his older brother getting yet another night off, and his younger brother banished to washing up. After the chores were done, the family settled down for bed. Drew lay awake, still going over his plan, waiting for the characteristic snore of his father. Despite his best effort, Drew was almost asleep when the snoring began, pushing him to wakefulness. Slowly, he counted as he sat, mouthing the numbers silently. After he reached 20, he carefully and quietly slipped from his bed down the ladder. The faint creak of wood interrupted the snore for a moment, causing him to freeze. Once the snoring had resumed, Drew grabbed a blanket from the pile and began to pack his basket. One of his dad's knives, some bread and cooked meat, a jar of jam. Covering the bundle with the blanket and securing the basket lid, he considered carefully. What else would he need to make the journey? After a while, he added some water as well as flint and steel before heading out the back door. He was not leaving tonight, but he needed to put the basket out here, stowing it by the door. The cold air and late hour necessitated a visit to the outhouse, after which he snuck back to his bed and sleep. The dawn came, Drew's brothers waking him with a dog pile. Breakfast was swift, quickly consuming the ham roll and saying goodbye. Drew left by the back door, as he always did, grabbing the heavy basket and heading for the woods. The snow would come soon, but it had not fallen in the night. The first snow would be the end of foraging, so he could not wait. He broke into a run, making his way through the south woods quickly, until he reached the dry ravine, where they were not supposed to cross. The trees north of the ravine were dense, so he slowed to a jog, following his memorized path to the abandoned camp. It took more than 2 hours to reach the site, the stones and shelter still marking it. Drew stopped by the camp, calling out for Rudolph before turning north and walking. Eyes and ears peeled for any sign of Rudolph or wolves. Noon arrived 4 hours later. The steep forest floor was no place to camp, so Drew pushed on, eating some of the cooked meat and bread as he walked. The ground levelling off after a couple more hours, but the trees grew even more densely, reducing the usefulness of his search, so he began calling out more frequently. By mid-afternoon, Drew came upon another camp. The same stones and shelter remains, but this camp included bones. 2 wolves had lost their lives here, picked clean of meat and left to the elements. Calling out a dozen times, Drew couldn't imagine Rudolph fighting off 2 wolves, let alone defeating them. Perhaps the camp belonged to a hunter, a careless hunter that let 2 wolves into his camp. Neither seemed likely, but hope drove him to call out again. This time there was a response, but not what he hoped. It was a howl, a wolf howl. It came from the west, so Drew began to run, continuing north as fast as the dense trees would allow. He could hear the wolves behind him, the dense thicket slowing him more than them, so he stopped by the largest fir and began to climb. No easy task, but fear forced him higher. He was halfway up when the wolves arrived. 2 of them. They could not climb at least, but they would wait for a meal, and he couldn't hang here for long. The branches were too weak for him to loosen his grip, so he called out, "Help! Rudolph! Anyone help me!" He yelled and yelled until his throat gave out. The wolves grew in number, and soon 4 of them were circling, waiting for him to lose his grip, when the long-anticipated snow began to fall. Drew cried, still calling out when he could. He could feel his arms growing weaker, when a whooshing noise and a yelp caught his attention. One of the wolves had an arrow in its side. He looked around hopefully, summoning up another yell, "Help!" Another arrow struck a wolf, and soon they were running, scattering to the south. The rustling of trees from the north began as his saviour approached. He was carrying a bow and dressed in wolf skins, like a wild man. He came to the foot of the tree where Drew shivered in the cold evening air, looking down with fear and hope. The figure tilted its head upward for a moment, before pulling the fur hood back. Drew? Looking down with a huge smile, Drew could see the face of Rudolph. Dirty, but definitely him. He was alive. Wasting no time, Drew slid down the tree until he was safely on the ground, his arms thanking him with an ache. He grabbed Rudolph and hugged him. "I thought you were dead!" he almost yelled. "The wolves will be back soon. We need to move," whispered Rudolph, before turning north to lead the way.